So my esteemed colleagues on the panel, Jeff Towers with TVPX, Trust Company. They also have, a forum for DARs and customs and some other things. But primarily he's a trust expert. And Jason is a partner at King and Spalding and an expert in aviation transactions. So this topic is new and it's kind of organic. It's changing almost monthly. And we're gonna really just hit the high points. There's no way we can really get into a lot of depth on GATS. And so if you have questions, ask us afterwards or send us an email and we surely try to respond. Speaking of GATS, we have a polling question. I don't know if it's up, but who knows what GATS actually means? What the acronym stands for? Does anyone know? One? Oh yeah, well, a couple of people. So GATS, yeah. GATS stands for Global Aircraft Trading Systems. So obviously a bunch of lawyers made the name up, right? Very complicated, but it's a product of the Aviation Working Group, the AWG. And you guys probably know, if you don't know the AWG, you know who they are. It's basically made up of the manufacturers and banks and leasing companies. So Boeing, Airbus, GE, Bombardier, Embraer, they're all part of the AWG. And so it's a very powerful force in our industry and a very significant players, and they're invested in this thing we call GATS. Also, remember Cape Town. I can remember, sitting in the early 90s at a conference listening to Jeffrey Wool talk about Cape Town, and everyone thought, well, that's never going to come around. Well, that's a product of the AWG. The AWG was behind Cape Town, and we all have Cape Town now. So what's the main purpose of GATS? To it here. Not working. Okay, hang on. So the first bullet point, main purposes of GATS, is basically cut and pasted from the website. I've read it several times. I really don't understand it, honestly. So my definition for GATS is basically it's a mechanism for promoting owning aircraft through trust worldwide, and trading. When you buy and sell an interest in an aircraft, you're buying and selling the beneficial interests under a trust. So you're not really buying and selling the metal, you're buying and selling the beneficial interest of the trust agreement. And it's set up on a e-ledger type of format that uses form documents, and it's going to eventually probably have like a blockchain technology with it. So GATS, main thing, they want to use trust to facilitate buying and selling aircraft, and there are a number of reasons for that. So with that background, Jeff, take us through a little bit of exactly, why do we use trust on U.S. deals and what's the purpose?
So trust is very both on business aircraft and especially with commercial aircraft. They're just one of the structures that are allowed to be used to register aircraft in the United States. As we all know, in the U.S. is an owner registry. Owners have to satisfy citizenship requirements. A trustee and owner trust is once they are a U.S. citizen, then
Hello. So, and Jeff, the key component for GATS purposes of the trust is the separation of legal title with beneficial ownership.
Yeah, that's correct. In a trust relationship, in any trust relationship, there's an entity that holds legal, or a person it could be, that holds legal title to an asset, that's referred to as the trustee, and then there's the beneficial owner, which in our world lingo we call the trustor, or the beneficiary. And they hold the beneficial interest under the trust, meaning that they are the ultimate owner of the assets.
So Jeff, how, like if we have this question come up a lot, but if someone's going to put an aircraft in trust with you, how do they know they're going to get it back? If they're giving you title to the aircraft.
Yeah, and contractually under the trust documents, and as those of you that use our own trust agreements say, pretty much the same thing regardless of which trust provider you're using. It forms of all been blessed by the FAA and all. But the trust agreement would provide that the beneficiary has the right to terminate the trust and get the asset back.
And so if you're owning the asset, so you're really the one calling the shots on maintenance and insurance and all those kind of things, right?
Well, in addition to the beneficiary having the right to terminate the trust and get the assets back, remember they have the asset. They own the asset there. There's a document, and it's all on the trust, where the trustee leases or provides or gives the rights and obligations having to do with the operation of the aircraft, maintenance of the aircraft, to either the beneficiary or to a third-party lessee. So that lessee is the party that's actually going to have both possession of the aircraft, the rights and obligations that go along with operating the aircraft, and the obligations to maintain and hangar and find pilots and all those kinds of things. So those kinds of obligations and rights are not something that the trustee would ever really be burdened with. It would be very rare for a trustee to even see an aircraft that's held in trust.
Now this is a schematic of typical trust ownership. The aircraft, title to the aircraft goes to the owner trustee, and then they're entering into a trust agreement with the beneficiary and an aircraft operating lease agreement. You know, often that's back to the same beneficiary or the trustor, but in this second hypothetical, it's a lease to a third-party operator. How often do you see that in the business aviation world?
So in business aviation, more often than not, the lease is to the beneficiary. Sometimes it's to a third party. On the commercial aircraft side, though, the leases are almost always going to be to a third party, an airline or something like that that's going to actually operate the aircraft.
And we'll talk about the lease is kind of important because a lease to a third party or to an airline or to an operator is a major reason why GATS is out there, and we'll kind of distinguish between business aircraft and commercial aircraft a little more on that regard. But so Jason, talking about GATS, can you just give us a little more detail?
Sure. So as just mentioned, there are different types of trusts that are permitted under the GATS structure. They're the statutory trusts, business trusts, and common law trusts. The three jurisdictions that have been set out in the GATS material are Ireland, Singapore, and the United States. So those trust documents will be governed by the laws of that jurisdiction, and the laws of that jurisdiction will then affect the perfection and creation and all the normal things you would think they would affect. So the question probably many of you guys are asking is, well, why would I be doing this, or why do I care about the GATS system? The primary purpose is to facilitate the trading of the beneficial ownership of the trust from one owner to another. In other words, if Jeff owned an aircraft through a trust, he was the beneficiary of the trust, and I wanted to buy his plane, I could just buy his beneficial ownership of the aircraft, of the trust, and then I would effectively own the aircraft because I would be in control and have the right to terminate the trust and have it transferred to me. So we'll get into a little more details of the pros and cons and the applicability to business aviation versus commercial aviation a little bit later. But the GATS system is primarily set up to create a system that reduces friction in an otherwise cumbersome transactional process for conveying ownership of aircraft. So if I were to just buy the aircraft from Jeff instead of buying the beneficial ownership, we'd have to go through the whole registration, re-registration, FAA bill of sale, everything else. By just buying the beneficial ownership, the registration of the aircraft doesn't change. It just goes to me from Jeff. He's got several planes, so he could sell me a lot.
Yeah, and I think to reiterate something that you said, so it's not just for U.S. transactions. So they're pushing this. They've got trusts set up under the laws of Ireland, Singapore, and the United States. Those are the three jurisdictions that they're looking at now. But the goal is to promote the use of ownership of aircraft under trust throughout the world. This is not just a U.S. focus.
It's a voluntary system, and it's, as Jeff and Scott mentioned earlier, it's fully electronic. E-signatures, all documents will be uploaded to a virtual escrow room, and consents and releases will be lodged electronically.
So a big component of GATS, I think, is what they call the e-ledger. And tell us a little more about that.
Sure. So the e-ledger is a web-based ledger that is going to record all of the details of the GATS trust. It'll record the trustee, the aircraft, equipment by manufacturer, make, serial number. It'll record the beneficiary of the trust, and then it will also record any security interest that's granted to a financing party over that beneficial interest in the trust. Anytime you affect any of the four things I just mentioned, it's going to create a record at the e-ledger that will one day be searchable, and you can find out if there's a security interest that's lodged against the beneficial interest in the trust. You can find out previous owners of that beneficial ownership of the trust. If it's been conveyed to several parties before you, you can see that chain. So it looks like it's a pretty well thought out system in terms of the information that it's intending to record there.
Right. And is there a legal significance to having something on this e-ledger, or is it no different than just having a notepad with some of this written down on it?
Sure. So the legal significance is somewhat debatable. It certainly doesn't have any impact on priority of a security interest. But what does it do? To have a GATS trust, you have to have GATS in the name, right, Jeff? And then you will get assigned a unique identification number. So if I'm a party or I'm representing a party who's buying an aircraft and I see a GATS trust in the trust documents and I say, wow, okay, well, let's see what's on the e-ledger regarding that trust. If I find a security interest that's lodged against the beneficial interest, then I'm concerned and I'll know it needs to be cleared up or it needs to be released or it's something I'll have to deal with. I think because of the simple logic that I just laid out, if it's a GATS trust, you know it's going to be registered on the e-ledger. It's incumbent on you to look, and by looking and finding something, it then has a legal significance of putting you on actual notice of something being out there. Now, That, of course, is debatable. There's other things that go into it, but I would argue there is that legal significance of having actual notice.
Right, and a lot of people don't realize, actually, the Federal Aviation Act, Title 49, provides that you're on notice of anything that's recorded at the FAA, but also anything that you have actual notice of. So other jurisdictions, including the United States, actual notice of another person's rights or interests, it can be meaningful. So one of the other, positive things, or for GATS, is the use of standardized documents, pre-approved standardized documents. How do you see that working out in practice? Do you think that's a...
Sure. So the material and the guidance material for GATS is pretty careful on this point. They do want to standardize documents in the trust agreement, the transfer provisions, or the transfer agreements for transferring the beneficial ownership, and even the security interest. I think they're looking at having that as a standard document. They say that, then they also say later on that we are not trying to in any way dictate terms or require you to use these documents. Now, saying that, I do see a lot of benefit in standardizing the trust agreement and standardizing the transfer instrument, particularly when you need to do some digging and make sure that those transfers were accomplished appropriately under GATS.
Do you see that either of you, do you see that the use of standardized documents, like if you have a portfolio of aircraft, 100 aircraft, and they're all under the same, maybe not the same trust, but the exact same document, it looks exactly the same, the transfer of the beneficial interest looks exactly the same, the beneficial interest security agreement looks exactly the same. Do you see that maybe helping facilitate large financings or people wanting to get into the industry?
Well, that's exactly the idea. In the commercial setting, there might be a sale of a portfolio of aircraft, and there might be 100 aircraft that are being sold. So anything that can be done to use automation to make the process simpler and to still protect everybody's rights, that's the whole idea behind GATS. Try to make a more automated system. I think probably long-term their goal is to, or short-term, is to try to mesh with some of the changes that might be coming down the road with the FAA. Eventually, as Scott mentioned, they're going to try to or consider migrating onto a blockchain kind of platform. And the other thing I think that it's important to share with people, since I've only seen a very small glimpse of this, but it's an online system, and if you sort of picture in your mind what the International Registry website looks like, that'll give you at least a head start on what this would look like. There's administrators who are authorized by each one of the parties in a GATS transaction to take certain actions on the website, to give consents or authorize things to happen. Again, very much like the International Registry website. There's the ability to do searches, as Jason was mentioning. So just again, for the sake of context, so you understand what it is that we're talking about when we talk about GATS, picture in your mind something similar to the International Registry website.
So, there we go. So we talked a little bit earlier about leasing, and for commercial aircraft, the fact that a lot of commercial aircraft, when they're bought and sold, are subject to a lease. They're being operated by an airline. And so buying and selling the beneficial interest under a trust is great in that instance because it doesn't ground the aircraft. You're not changing title to the aircraft. So the aircraft can continue to be operated under the lease. You buy and sell the beneficial interest under the trust, and the aircraft's not grounded. That could also have benefits in business aviation. If you want to buy an aircraft and you buy the beneficial interest under trust, you don't have to, there are less documents to file with the FAA. You don't have to get a fly wire. There are some issues like that that the GATS system will help in the business aviation sense.
Right. The first transaction when an aircraft goes into GATS trust, from an FAA perspective, it's going to look similar to any any other transaction where title is being taken by a trust. There's still going to be a trust agreement, there's still going to be a lease, and documents that are filed with the FAA will continue to be filed with the FAA. The efficiencies occur when the next transfer happens, when the aircraft are in a GATS trust, and rather than transferring title to the aircraft like we would normally do in a business aviation transaction, the beneficial interest in the trust is transferred, which, as Scott mentioned, means that you're not changing registration of the aircraft, it's still going to be registered to the owner trustee. It may have some sales tax benefits or transfer tax benefits or other tax benefits, depending upon the jurisdictions that are involved. And it just makes one of the parties to a transaction, it makes the process simpler. At least that's the goal of GATS.
So we're at the stage with the GATS documentation where we talked about them supposedly being non-negotiable documents, uniform, and pre-approved by the FAA. They're not actually pre-approved by the FAA yet, but we think they will be soon. We've made the application to have the forms approved, and they're in the process. But one thing is that GATS doesn't change the fact that you have to file the same documents with the FAA that you always would if you were using a trust. So you've got to file the trust agreement itself. You've got to file. Basically, the FAA rule or the law behind it is you have to file each document that legally affects a relationship under the trust has to be filed with the FAA in support of registration. So even though you have this GATS system, even though you have pre-approved documents, you're still going to need to file the trust agreement with the FAA, the assignments of the beneficial interest with the FAA, any amendments to those documents have to be filed with the FAA. You might not have to obtain a FAA counsel's opinion every time you file documents with the FAA, because there are strong arguments that if you're using this GATS system and these pre-approved form documents, that it's just silly to have to go get an opinion each time. And so that would actually be helpful, cut down on time and cost. There's also a question, though, and the FAA is looking at this a little more closely about whether or not you may have to file the actual beneficial interest security instrument with the FAA. You didn't have to in the past, but I know they're looking at that issue a little more closely right now.
And Scott, won't that depend on the content of that beneficial interest security agreement? I think you were mentioning that the form that's been proposed is really a tri-party agreement between the grantor, the grantee, and then the lessee. Is that right?
That's right. The document, the GATS form of documents, everything's carefully entwined, and so they may take a different position on the GATS trust than they've taken on the others. But I think it'll be uniform. I think whatever position the FAA takes, it'll apply to not only this trust but other trusts. But we don't know for sure. So we've hit on some of the pros for GATS already in the use of GATS trust. Jason, what are a few of the cons? I mean, what are some of the, what's the downside of buying a company, like the stock of a company, rather than having an asset purchase?
Sure. Well, when I first got asked to speak about this and we got on the phone, my first question to both these gentlemen was, how many times do you guys come across a transaction where it's proposed that an aircraft buyer is just going to buy the beneficial ownership of a trust? And I was careful to say in the business context. I recognize it happens quite a bit in the commercial context. And then we all kind of scratched our head, and it really comes up very rarely. So why does it come up rarely? And that is really your question. And that, I think, is because you're assuming liabilities that are unknown. You can draft around it, but there's still, you didn't create the trust. You didn't have anything to do with the operation of the trust or the operation of the aircraft before you bought it. And you ultimately are going to be relying on the lessee to support an indemnity obligation that will trickle all the way through to you as the beneficiary. But In the commercial context, the party providing that full-blown indemnity is an airline and has the financial wherewithal of a large airline, and you would think that concern is much less than in a one-off business aircraft, where you really got to analyze that. So that's just one.
Right. I think there's also, I don't know what's happening here. There we go. I think there's also, it's an interesting dilemma, because for years, people, who actually wanted to or believed in the benefits of Cape Town and registering under the treaty, you'd want to be able to register your interest or claim that your cell fell under the treaty because you had the benefits of the treaty. But if you're selling the beneficial interest under a trust, or if you're granting a beneficial interest security agreement, that's probably not something that falls under the treaty. So people have to get their mind around, if they think it's beneficial to register on the international registry, which I think it is, does that outweigh the use of the GATS system of buying and selling beneficial interest under a trust? It doesn't mean you couldn't use a GATS trust, like I own an aircraft under a GATS trust, and then Jason sets up another GATS trust, and we just file a bill of sale and deem that a sale and register it on the international registry. But it's a little different than the buying the interest under a trust rather than title to the aircraft. I think, and one other thing that I wanted to hit on just a little bit, and that is kind of the difference between a lot of business transactions that we see and commercial transactions we see. On the commercial transactions, everyone's lawyered up to the hilt. They know exactly what they're doing. They've done all the research. There's substantial companies involved. They can get pretty comfortable that an indemnity that it means something or it doesn't mean something. They know. In the business aircraft world, it's often not that clear cut. I mean, you may be buying an aircraft on a back-to-back transaction, or you may be buying the aircraft out of a jurisdiction where they don't really have as good of records and things like that. So it'll be interesting to see if and I do think there's a benefit to GATS from a business aviation perspective, but it's a different view. It's a different look than when you're doing commercial aviation deals.
One quick point I want to bring up now while we're running close to our time limit. If the folks in this room encounter a GATS trust in one of their transactions, I think it's going to affect their transactions in a few different ways. The first way is if there's financing involved, the lender is going to insist on taking a security interest in the beneficial ownership of that trust. And the reason for that is there can be only one security interest granted in that beneficial ownership of the trust, and it must be filed in the GATS system. So if I'm a lender and I know I'm dealing now with a GATS trust, well, because it's a GATS trust, there's the notice issue I mentioned earlier. I want to make sure the world is on notice that I have a security interest in that beneficial interest. So it's something for everybody to be aware of, and it could affect you.
So should we answer questions, or everyone's been great sports? They're staying. Hate to stay much longer. So, all right. So can a foreign citizen set up a GATS trust? If yes, any limitations? If not, why would an Irish or Singapore citizen be excluded?
Foreign trusts are used quite commonly, especially business aviation, is one of the primary reasons of creating a structure where a non-U.S. citizen can hold beneficial interest in and be the operator of an aircraft that is registered in the U.S. The advantage to registering in the U.S. is one of the jurisdiction where most aircraft in the world are registered. So, yeah, you can certainly set up a GATS trust with a non-citizen beneficiary.
Another question, how would you expect the use of GATS instruments to impact the due diligence that owner trustees must conduct on their beneficiaries? Jeff?
I don't think it's going to change anything at all. We still have
Does GATS require registration to make filings on the GATS system similar to TUE on the IR?
Yes, it does. You have to be a GATS participant or a GATS trustee to use the GATS system. It involves you agreeing to the terms with AWG to use the system, and it also requires you to be in compliance with your KYC AML things. That's the lender side. And you need to maintain your position as a GATS trustee.
Correct. Yeah, there's so far only two companies that are TVPX, banks, TVPX. I'm sure the other providers will be right around the corner. The system is evolving as we speak, and remember being similar to this in Miami, we did a new system years ago, or 15 years ago. Not going to take time. They're going to be very more about that over the next 6 months or so.
All right, thank you so much, Al. Hand it back.
And I think the fact you got so many questions at the end was fantastic.